we're now going up in time, and you should be happy if you're thinking we're going to eventually get to 2024. We're at 1965, and we're going to continue apace each hour with a new year. So we're at 1965 now. No, I'm kidding. We're going to talk about 1965 and the Hart-Celler Act and beyond, and we're going to ask lots and lots of questions about continuity and rupture in this panel. And I think that's been a theme that's really come out throughout the conference about, you know, what can we say about American immigration policy that has remained the same, and what has changed, and how is it different for different groups. So I'm really delighted to introduce this panel. My name is Lila Corwin-Berman. I am a professor of history at Temple University. Today, this afternoon, we'll be hearing from Jana Lipman, who's a professor at Tulane, and her most recent book is called In Camps: Vietnamese Refugees, Asylum Seekers, and Repatriates. Shaul Kellner, who is a professor of Jewish studies and sociology at Vanderbilt and has a book hot off the presses, or not quite off the presses? Okay, hot off the presses, called A Cold War Exodus: How American Activists Mobilized to Free Soviet Jews. And finally, Jesse Hoffning-Garskoff, who's professor of history at Harvard, and most recently has written Racial Migrations, New York City, and the Revolutionary Politics of the Spanish Caribbean. So we decided as a group when we were just caucusing that we're going to be talking a lot about 1965 and a piece of legislation that came out in 1965 that is in many ways conventionally understood to be the end of the period of Johnson Reed, to be the end of this period of the 1924 quota regime. And we're going to be asking a lot of questions about the kind of conventional understanding of it. But sometimes we get so eager to problematize and ask those questions that we forget to talk a little bit about just some of the specifics of, you know, what did people understand, and what have historians and sort of a general public sort of imagined as happening in 1965 to immigration. And some of you might know, and some of you might be thinking about other things that were happening in the 60s, like the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So Jesse, I want to start with you, and this maybe will be a tiny bit painful for you because you actually have a lot of really important critiques of the kind of quote-unquote conventional understandings of 1965. But as a way to help us kind of set up some of the analytical tensions, can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that that Hart-Celler Act is generally understood, especially its relationship to the 1924 Act?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really, it's a really interesting and important question. I just want to start with the recognition, and I think it's an important recognition that's usually hidden in this very conversation that you're having, that there are two very significant immigration reforms that happened in 1965. One is the Hart-Celler Act, and the other is the end of the Bracero program, right? And so one basically overshadowing the other is one of the main critiques that I have of this conversation, but I just want to put that out there, that there are two big pieces of legislation. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act is the revision of the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, which had incorporated many things from the 1924 law, but it also updated some things and reshaped some other things. But the 1965 reforms, basically, if you think about the 1924 Act as it's been described to you as being one, against a I was thinking we have four main points about it that we've heard so far today. One, it's against a backdrop of a wide array of attempts to try and limit immigration that mostly target individuals, so literacy, public health, public charge, and those are openly discriminatory and oftentimes do actually target groups, right? They're used to target groups even though they focus on individuals. So that's one thing about Johnson Reed that you already know, that it's got a lot of other aspects. But the other thing that you've heard about Johnson Reed is that it is novel in that it poses a worldwide, or a universal cap on the total number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere that are coming in, and that's a transformative act in U.S. immigration history, that there's now a normative assumption that people won't get in unless they're one of the few. And the other that we've heard is that there are openly discriminatory quotas assigned to each individual nation state in the world according to a very complex and actually basically fantastical notion of what the current stock in 1920 of the U.S. population is. And that is as Professor Nye has shown really brilliantly, that is a confection that statisticians put together knowing that they're in fact creating a fiction, because they don't count anybody who's Asian, they don't count anybody who's African American, they don't count anybody who's from the Western Hemisphere, intentionally as a way of that, and then they represent this as the natural US origin stock, which then they're gonna base on. That discriminatory quota system targets many groups. And then the fourth thing that you've learned about the 1924 Act is that it didn't actually apply either the worldwide cap or the individual country quotas to the Western Hemisphere. So the 1964, the traditional account of the 1965 Act, and I think you've already sort of probably heard this a little bit today, is that in many ways the 1965 Act is the corrective. This is the way at least the liberal proponents of the Act was. It was the corrective of this great aberration in American history, because America was a nation of immigrants, and then aberrationally, nativism arose in the 1920s and targeted immigrants, and now the 1965 Act would neutralize the negative and discriminatory acts. And in fact, Lyndon Johnson, who signs the bill under the Statue of Liberty, says this finally erases the shadow of discrimination from our American, legal landscape. And in this sense, it's actually really a classic mid-20th century liberal gesture, because it eliminates most of the explicit discrimination although not all of the explicit discrimination, but then creates a really discriminatory immigration regime that I think, this gets into the critique, that presents itself as totally fair, and why is anybody violating this because it's already fair? So of the four main points that you learned about 1924 today, the first point, what we call the admissibility statutes, all of those individual, including public charge, at this point homosexuality, non-normative sexuality of any kind, certain kinds of family arrangements, polygamy, drunkenness, all kinds of individualized and oftentimes applied to communities as a whole, discriminatory language stays in. And the idea of a worldwide cap stays in. In fact, it's expanded, because it wasn't originally applied to the Western Hemisphere, but it was actually in this act, in the name of fairness, was applied for the first time to the Western Hemisphere. So there had not been limits on Western Hemisphere immigration before, but now there are. And actually, quotas weren't abolished either. Quotas were kept in place per country quotas, but they were now equalized across all the countries of the world at a maximum of 20,000, right? So the idea was, this is fair. Now it's first come, first serve, up to a certain limit for every country, and that is no longer discriminatory. Although, as Professor Losa points out, if there are 500,000 Mexican people crossing the border the year before the passage of the act, and there are only 20,000 visas available, what you're doing is either creating a very, very long line for some people in the world and no line for others, or creating a situation where people who are going to cross anyway because they're part of the labor system are going to be redefined as vulnerable because they violated certain kinds of immigration norms. And then the Western Hemisphere exclusion, again, that's this from the perspective of more than half of all of the people who immigrated after 1965. 1965 didn't neutralize the effects of 1924. It expanded them to apply newly to that category of people. So to get back to the original question, if you think about the ways that I think the popular culture, the news media, and I think maybe high school history textbooks talk about 1965 as part of a civil rights era, as the end of discrimination. So one is that its intent and its main purpose was to eliminate discrimination. People who have looked at the actual congressional debates suggest that that's not exactly true. There was a debate. There was a lot of compromise there. The second is that it ushered in a new age of mass immigration. We've already heard that, in fact, mass immigration was never really ended, was hidden in some ways by the mass deportability of Mexicans in the middle of the century, and actually in many instances starts up again before 65 or much after, as we'll hear for others. And then the third is that the 1965 Act, the third kind of major kind of presumption about it is that it shifted the origin of immigrants to the United States from traditional European origins to Latin American and Asian origins. And it's definitely true that most of the immigrants after the 1965 Acts, or the two laws passed in 1965, are from Asia and Latin America. But if you already have guessed that an act that was actually restrictive with respect to Latin American immigrants can't possibly be the thing that generated their growth in the United States. So it is not true that this generated the growth. And in fact, if you go and look at many of the Asian societies that started to send more immigrants, in a couple instances, it's very much facilitated by the new law. But in other cases, there are many other factors that are going into this. And of course, the reason why Europeans stopped coming has much more to do with the development of the European Union and Europe as a place that was attracting immigrants rather than a place that was sending off immigrants, than it has anything to do with what Congress legislated.
And I think it's worth remembering, it feels like it was a long time ago when that first panel was up here, but Professor Nye talking about the language of the nation of immigrants, which was a Cold War language and which became so important in the 60s. And I think it just speaks to the point you're making about kind of a conceptual shift that did involve not assigning these kinds of quotas based on a kind of reactionary sense of what the American population was meant to be. So there is something about a kind of reconceptualization of what it meant to be a liberal American at that point that you're speaking to. And then there's a kind of unevenness with how the law itself is written and how it's applied. So I'm wondering, Jana, if you can kind of help us start to unpack some of the ways in which, and I think Jesse already started to hint at some of them, in which the kind of conceptual nation of immigrants idea and the kind of liberal ideals that are within that are challenged by some of the ways in which the law is actually working and applied to different groups of people.
So, thanks so much. I'm going to turn the question around a little bit, but hopefully we'll still provide some context. So one of the main categories that we've not discussed, as I think was Nathaniel spoke in the last panel, is this idea of refugees. And so some of the people who come in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s are colloquially and in the media called refugees. And I'm thinking here about both people coming from the Displaced Persons Act, Europeans in the 40s and early 50s, but also Hungarians who come after the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, and then Cubans who come after the Cuban Revolution. And then in my work, Vietnamese who come after 1975. But what's useful to understand is that none of these people enter as refugees as a legal category. And I think that this is something which isn't apparent, because when people talk in the media and politicians speak, they talk about refugees. Hungarians, though, are admitted as parolees. This idea of parole is the idea that the president, the executive branch, can let in a large number of people for political reasons. And this is outside of the 1924 law, and it will also be outside of the 1965 law. So again, this idea there are exceptions, and they are large exceptions. The Hungarians, I think, is about 36,000 people. For Cubans, it's thousands who come in 59 and then through the 1960s and 70s. And then Vietnamese who come in 1975, approximately 125,000 enter as parolees. And where this fits with liberalism is that in the United States, this identity of refuginess is tied to anti-communism, right? And this, again, is very different from the imagined idea of the UNHCR, a person who meets the definition of political persecution. There's nothing ideological in that international definition. However, in the US, it's very much tied to anti-communism, and this becomes a very consistent way that the executive branch gets around these limits in the legislation to let in groups that are found to be ideologically valuable for the US to admit. So.
Interesting. So, and that actually is a great lead-in, I think, to asking you, Shaul, a little bit to talk about the work that you've been doing on Soviet Jews and the ways in which that history does or does not actually overlap with, some of the conventional understandings of 1965 and its transformation.
I could do a whole study of Soviet Jewry without making reference to 1965 for precisely this reason and this is the largest late 20th century migration of Jews to the United States. About 500,000 Soviet Jews or Jews from former Soviet republics will come here. It's not the only wave of Jewish migration, which I want to hold for a second because that's an important piece, and that will tie back to 65. But they are being let in first as parolees. Then they will be given refugee status. There's a very, very large debate between advocates for Soviet Jewry and the American government on one side and the Israeli government on the other. And the Israeli government had a definition of refugee that's not the United Nations definition. Their definition was, for the sake of Jews, if Jews have a country that is willing to accept them, the category of Jewish refugee cannot exist. And so to accept Jews into the United States as refugees, it goes against that. But there was a point in the 1980s when, because of competition with other refugee groups for spaces and for government funding, because people coming in as parolees, as refugees, are receiving government benefits, they're eligible for different types of support, and there's conflict and competition between people who are advocating for bringing Jews from the Soviet Union, but people coming from Haiti and the like, and there's another country that's willing to take them. And in some ways it serves the American government's purpose to say, well, if that's the case, then we're going to give more of our parolee slots or the refugee slots to evangelical Christians from the former Soviet Union, Haitians, and the like. Now, if you think about other categories of Jewish immigrants to the United States after 1965, Persian Jews, Jews coming from Iran, Jews coming from Syria as well, and they're entering also outside of this 1965 framework. They're entering as parolees or as refugees or via family reunification. But then you have the Israelis, and that's probably the largest migration of Jews to the US that you could say would fit under this general category of a labor migration with preferred categories because people are coming in often as professional workers, knowledge workers, or the like. And they may not be coming in as immigrants, they may be coming in as temporary workers on H-1Bs or the like, but that really is the one case of a substantial Jewish migration to the US that does not fit this framework of Jews are coming in as refugees. I would add also South Africans as well.
That's fascinating. So Jesse, I know that I made you kind of tell us the conventional understanding, but I'm hoping you can also help us think through more of what it means to kind of bring in the Western Hemisphere to this system of, the continuity is that even if there aren't quote unquote quotas, as other panels have said, this is still a kind of numerically driven system. This is still guided by a logic that there are numbers of people who can come as quote unquote legal. So can you talk a little bit about that context?
Yeah, so this gets to the question, the first point that I made, that there are two reforms that happened in 1965. So to go back to what Professor Losa was saying, and also to refer back to Professor Nyes this morning, the reason why Western Hemisphere migrants were not included in the original 1924 restrictions, either as a hemispheric cap or by country cap, was very clearly the power of employers in the West and Southwest who wanted access to Mexican labor. Especially, they said, since we no longer have access to Asian laborers because of immigration law. And they're successful at blocking that. It wasn't because the eugenicists and the Boston Brahmins didn't want to exclude Mexicans. It's because they came up against a more powerful force. The result of that is the creation of a under the Border Patrol of a racialized labor force that was always removable on immigration grounds, right? So there is a very large undefended border. There are all kinds of new individualized restrictions that are applied to mostly Mexicans, but other Latin Americans, and they therefore usually cross the border without inspection. They're encouraged to do so because when they get across the border, they are incorporated into the labor system enthusiastically. But then, as the Border Patrol grows, it's given the power not just to police the border, but to police the entire region of the borderlands where lots and lots of Mexican origin as well as Mexican ethnic US born or US naturalized workers are working, and empowered to stop and frisk people and interrogate people and deport people on suspicion of being undocumented or of being, of not being there lawfully. And then that expands into basically a government-sponsored project to do that in the Bracero program, which between the Second World War and the 1960s was a binational program to basically provide removable labor to employers in the United States from Mexico. So the Mexican government and the United States government participated in it. It was supposed to reduce the vulnerability of those workers because they would have some kind of legal recourse and contracts. But in fact, the United States government and planters conspired to undermine all of those elements of the program. And the way that they did this was by, instead of recruiting the braceros on the Mexican side of the border, recruiting braceros on the US side of the border. So they encouraged Mexican citizens to cross the border without inspection and to either, when they came into contact with employers or with officials, they would then be bussed back to the border, processed as braceros, and brought in. And that was really significant because it basically created a system in which the US economy, huge parts of the US economy, one of the most dynamic parts of the US economy, including many Jewish immigrants in the East Coast who were consuming the vegetables and the other produce that was being produced by those communities, and Mexican communities that were all depending on massive, like almost 500,000 people a year who were moving across the border and oftentimes moving back. So they come for a season or two and then go back, or come for a season and go back, and sometimes go back to Mexico and then sometimes come back a few years later for another few seasons. And 1965, the two things that happen, one is the United States ends the Bracero program, and the other is that when it creates now an ostensibly fair system in which all countries get the same number of visas, it assigns Mexico 20,000 visas, maximum of 20,000 visas. There were 450,000 Bracero contracts the year before, and 50,000 immigrant visas given to Mexico. So the people who, even in this system that wasn't really favoring it, were managing to get visas and come and immigrate as immigrants. And you've got 20,000 available now, and so what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen is those same people are gonna cross in the same exact fashion. They will not have changed their morality, they will not have changed their goals, they will not have changed anything, but when they're encountered, rather than being defined by the US government as braceros, they're gonna be defined as undocumented. And this unleashes a wave of, I think that the description of the mismatch between the expectations that politicians set about what can be done in the migration field and the kinds of things that they can actually do, that cycle in the media and in politics, basically you could, from the perspective of Latin American immigrants, you could just define this period as basically a secular increase in border militarization and crisis logic. Every time you get more Border Patrol agents, they arrest more people. There are more images on TV of people being arrested. There's more of a sense that there's a crisis of undocumented immigration, even though it's the same, it's actually maybe fewer than it was a few years ago. And there's more to be gained as a politician from inveighing against undocumented workers and promising more border enforcement. And that's a cycle. It's not like it's been always always the same at the same pace, but it's a cycle that has actually basically accelerated over the course of the period after 1965. And if you tell the story of 1965 as if it has just neutralized all of the unfairness in the system, you completely misunderstand late 20th century immigration for that reason.
So one of the other kinds of, I guess we have the advantage of being a little later in the day and being able to pull out some of the cross-cutting themes, but it's been really interesting to see the relationship between kind of law on its face and law in practice. And also trying to think through how much were these practices intended by those who are crafting the law? How much were they some of the unintended consequences? What's the relationship between the kind of discourse of that liberalism and what is clearly an exclusionary illiberal kind of system? And a way of starting to get at some of the new sorts of relationships that new laws can create is to think about how in the wake of 1965, are there different opportunities or necessities for coalitions, for solidarities among different groups, right? So even if we need to, those of us who might have had more of a kind of textbook understanding of 65 really need to revise some of our ideas about this being a kind of clear turning point, it is historically the case that the law does change the kinds of coalitions and solidarities that groups build. So, Shaul, do you want to start us by talking a little bit about some of the, because you were kind of drawing some of the unexpected tensions and relationships depending on where Jews were coming from and their relationship to Israel into different categories. How in your work do you see, or are there ways in which you see 65 as sort of offering new forms of coalition politics?
Yeah, certainly. And to draw another continuity with some of the previous sessions, immigration did not stop, the gates did not close after 1924, and I think that's crucial for understanding the position that Jewish Americans and Jewish American organizations have played in this. And next session we're going to hear from Haya, so I'm not going to steal that thunder. But Jewish American organizations that had evolved to serve Jewish immigrants continued serving, and they maintained expertise, they maintained networks, they maintained relationships with government, so that even in a period where Jewish immigration dropped, that never dropped completely, and the organizations retained this expertise. And what that meant was that they were able also to deploy that expertise in the service of other groups. And this played out at the local level with, for example, the Jewish Family Service organizations. And there were a lot of communities in which when parolees from Vietnam were coming in, Jewish Family Services, along with Catholic Charities and many other groups, were voluntary agencies that actually helped to serve with the resettlement needs, English language, job placement, housing, and the like. And that was a basis for community building. It was a basis for solidarity. There was a change in, if you look at the way that HIAS will speak about the work that it does now versus the work that it did 100 years ago. It was something to do, I'm gonna get the line wrong, that in the past we served because the people coming were Jews. Now we serve because we are Jewish. That is to say, it becomes an issue of values and coalition building. And of course, at the same time, and I mentioned this before, so I won't go into it again, but this notion of competition among different American groups for parolee and refugee slots, and where should government money be allocated when there is another country that's willing to accept. And that also played in. So there were issues of division around that really emerged in the 1980s. And there were times when the US government was going to essentially to pull the presumption of refugee status from Soviet Jews. And we get in 1989 the Lautenberg Amendment, which gives the presumption that Jews coming from the Soviet Union have the presumption of a well-founded fear of persecution, whether because of what happened directly to them or to other Jews in the place. That also applied to others from the Soviet Union as well.
Interesting, and I do want to, because we happen to be sitting in this building, kind of make a plug for what this building does, which is it holds archives, and it holds archives for some of these organizations that Shaul has talked about, especially HIAS, but other organizations as well, where you can trace how those changes happened and what it meant to kind of repurpose an organization that had been geared to thinking about immigration as a kind of intra within the community context to something that would be serving in a different kind of civic role, using the expertise, as you said, that had been developed to work with the government and work with other populations. And I think it does bring up a kind of tension, right, to the extent that these groups are both helping new populations settle and the extent to which these groups are helping to enact state policies that we have heard, and we're going to hear more of, also has some deeply troubling elements to them. So, Jan, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit from your work, how you've seen the kinds of solidarities, coalitions, and also maybe fractures.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and I was thinking about it as I was preparing for this event. I guess I would say a few things. So first of all, when the Vietnamese came, there are many of they're called VOLAGs, voluntary agencies. This is the lingo that's used at the time in the 1970s. And you see Catholic Charities, Lutheran Immigration Services is very significant for the Vietnamese. HIAS is there, although they're not as significant as Catholic Charities. I guess I want to say two or three things. So first, for the Vietnamese resettlement, the federal government's policy is that they do not want another Havana. I mean, there's another little Havana in Miami. So in some ways, when the Vietnamese are coming, they're coming in as parolees, and the government says, we want to resettle people. And you should know that this is contested. There are definitely people in the US who don't want to resettle the Vietnamese, but the Ford administration says, no, we have a responsibility, we're going to resettle people, but we're going to have people settled, dispersed throughout the country. So you'll get people in Buffalo, New York, you'll get people in Lawrence, Kansas, you'll get people in Texas. And the idea was that no one community should be responsible for all of the social services. So it actually relies on other ideas of solidarity and other ideas of social service. But it's also, for people who are being resettled, they often don't want to be the only family in a small town. And so you'll get secondary migration fairly early on. But the government's initial plan was this sort of dispersion, which is interesting in terms of social policy and government policy. The other thing that I wanted to add was that because of the 1975 large numbers of Vietnamese coming in, you will also get a large numbers of Vietnamese who will leave in the 1978, 79. And this will create, again, a sense of I think solidarity might be the wrong word, but political support for the United States resettling and accepting larger numbers of Vietnamese who are in refugee camps. And this will lead to the 1980 Refugee Act. And the 1980 Refugee Act is another critical law because it is the first, maybe the 1948 Displaced Persons Act would be the first, right? But in the modern era, 1980 is when we get a new law that says refugees are gonna be handled alongside other immigrants. There's this new formal category of refugees, and this is done by Congress. And it's after this we'll get some of this competition that Shaul is talking about who's gonna get those spots. So it's bipartisan in 1980. It has a lot of liberal support by people like Teddy Kennedy and Elizabeth Holtzman, but it also has Republican support because it's also creating limits as well. And the only thing, I just wanna be, I apologize for Shaul, but Haitians are definitely not getting the spots. So just to be very clear in terms of, there is competition, but the largest groups that are getting these spots are Southeast Asians and Russian Jews. Haitians are absolutely not being seen as refugees at this point. And in fact, I can talk a lot about that if people are interested in Q&A, but the United States almost systematically refuses Haitians as refugees consistently from the 70s through the present.
Idea that you need to detain people
Right, exactly.
who are applying for asylum in order to make it so
Yeah.
miserable to apply for
Yeah.
asylum that they will stop,
Yes.
is invented to try and deal with Haitian migrants in this period. So I think this is a really interesting question, and I think it's an interesting question to me because it's also a question that's very personal for me, because I am one of a few people who have been included in this discussion today who doesn't study Jewish immigration, who studies the immigration of other groups of people, but who in my own identity come from a family that was strongly identified as a Jewish immigrant family, even though the immigrants in my family are now 2 generations removed from me. And so as I teach immigration history and as I research immigration history, I'm always thinking about this question of solidarities, about the implicit solidarities and the explicit solidarities that I'm enacting in this work, but also the responsibilities that one has as a historian to try and think about the challenges of these solidarities. And I'll just, the first book that I wrote was a book about Washington Heights, New York, and Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic. Those of you who are not New Yorkers or who don't know, it's a neighborhood that had many post-war German Jewish immigrants, as well as some secondary migration from other Jewish communities in the city, as well as it's the most notable neighborhood for the settlement of the largest immigrant group in the post-war in New York, which is Dominicans, people from the Dominican Republic. And in my research, I found that in 1978, there was a mayor's task force to try and figure out what was going on in this neighborhood as both of these communities were living together, along with a lot of Irish and Greek New Yorkers as well. And they said some of the older residents in the neighborhood say that the problem with the new immigrants is that they're not assimilating like the older immigrants did. And it doesn't say these were Jewish immigrants who were saying this, or Jewish New Yorkers who were saying it. And I don't know who was in that particular instance, but I know that Jews have told the story of our own immigration and our own upward mobility in certain kinds of ways, and that those ways sometimes have to do with these kinds of distinctions, which are not only historically counterfactual, because it's not true that other groups assimilated in a different way, or that the current groups are not, but also that oftentimes really are invidious in the way that they impede the possibility of solidarities. And so I think the way that solidarities also have to do with the way we tell histories. The other way that people talk about this, or talked about it in Washington Heights at the time, were conflicts over schooling. In conflicts over schooling, it was very common for Jewish, second or third generation Jewish teachers to have a memory of Jewish overcoming racism and exclusion through a familial commitment to education, and therefore to extrapolate that other people who were not overcoming different forms of racism were not doing it because they lacked those kinds of cultural values, rather than because the racism was different or because the conditions were different. And so those are the kinds of difficulties that I was interested in trying to investigate, because there are many instances, including some that have already been mentioned, where you can see that Jews, and this is the importance of 1965, right? We know from Professor Garland, we know from Professor Marinari, that Jews, when they were fighting their own exclusion, had to make choices about whether to form solidarity, say, with Asians or with Italians, and sometimes made the decision that they had to keep narrowly focused on the people that they were most interested in trying to protect, and sometimes made strategic calculations to not even address certain issues, and sometimes did reach out. But when you get to the post-war period or the post-60s period, whether it's 65 or something else, as Jews are no longer the primary targets of American nativism, the question is different. It's, are Jews who are in a relative position of privilege, how are they going to interact in coalitions with people who are still being targeted in particular kinds of ways? And for all of our comrades at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh who were targeted precisely because they were doing refugee work, there are Stephen Millers who are perfectly willing and able to become imbricated into white supremacy. So I feel like there's a tension that I haven't been able to resolve there. Right,
and it's worth kind of thinking about how that tension is not a new one. I don't think it's only on the heels of a certain level of post-65, let's say, Jewish acceptance. I think even, and we heard some of this, even in debates about immigration restriction, and you were saying this, right, like different Jewish organizations were making calculations about, to what extent to sort of endorse the basic logic of a quota or of the idea of a kind of restriction, because that seemed to be required by the political times, and to what extent to sort of try to, around the edges, kind of pull it back from some of its more nefarious forms, let's say, right? So there's always this kind of, and it's certainly not just something that happens within Jewish politics, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's interesting, I think, to study these laws as social formations. So as much as these laws are social formations that help us understand domestic politics, it's also clear, this is not just a post-65 thing either, that immigration policy, which is often, it's interesting because it's included in sort of like domestic US history, but it's such a key part of American foreign policy, right? And somebody, it might have been Libby, some of the other speakers have used this idea of remote control, right? The ways in which the borders of the United States actually become sort of executed well outside of the United States. So I'd be curious to hear, and I can't remember, I think Jana, we were maybe gonna start with you, or we could start with whomever, how you think about this issue of the 1965 Immigration Act, but more generally kind of the second half of the 20th century US immigration policy as being a kind of form of American diplomacy, whether hard diplomacy or soft diplomacy.
No, I think that's a great question, and it's come up again several times today. And immigration and foreign policy are interrelated, right? I don't think that you can actually study immigration history without thinking about foreign policy. And I mean, I was thinking this morning that there was some discussions about Japan, right, in the early 20th century, in the 1907 quote-unquote gentleman's agreement. And so that's one form. In this era, it really, people can probably come up with other ideas as well in forms, but anti-communism and the Cold War is the dominant framework for thinking about immigration from 1950 up and through the early 90s. And it's useful to think about how actually the quote-unquote end of the Cold War has shifted, and I would say actually made it even harder for people to actually get refugee or asylum status. But anyway, to back up, again, it's about anti-communism. This is why Hungarians are admitted. This is why Cubans are allowed into the United States. This is why Vietnamese are allowed into the United States. And I can be very critical of the project that resettled Vietnamese in 1975, but it should be noted that it was a Republican president. There was a sense that this was a U.S. obligation, and that's because of the U.S. war in Vietnam. And then also scholarship has really tried to unsettle this as well. So the fear for this, or the mythology of this, would be that the United States is somehow finally doing the right thing, right? That the U.S. is resettling the Vietnamese. And I have a quote somewhere, it was in a newspaper from Arkansas where there were a lot of Vietnamese were sent. It was like, we're finally doing the right thing. This is how we're going to move forward. And there are other scholars said, we have to stop because the reason Vietnamese are refugees is because of the U.S. war in Vietnam. So to also be very careful to not be overly romantic about these settlement programs, which on the one hand, is particularly in this current moment where we have so little money and resources for resettlement, I think it's easy to be see those uncritically, I think the settlement programs generally were a good thing, but they cannot be divorced from a longer history of US war. And so to really think about that relationship between war and refugees as being intertwined, and how that affects both who is able to be resettled and why people in that case were refugees in the first place.
Let me just now remind the audience that this is the time when, if you have questions, you can write them down on an index card, and we'll be happy to consider some of them. Jesse, do you want to?
So I want to tell another anecdote from the first book that I worked on, which is that in 1961, a very, very brutal dictator in the Dominican Republic, who had been supported basically since the 1930s by the United States, was assassinated, likely by a group of people that were armed by the CIA. And this is right after the Bay of Pigs, and there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy in the Dominican Republic. The United States becomes involved in trying to manage possibly a transition to democracy and eventually not a transition to democracy. And in that period, the only place that you can get to the world from the Dominican Republic is the United States. If you want to get to any other part of the world by air, you must fly through the United States. So anyone who wants to leave what is a country in turmoil, including all of the people who are part of the former regime, they all have to get a visa to come through the United States, right? So they all start applying for visas to the United States, and soon many in the middle class who can afford a passport and all the other things you need for a visa start applying for visas. And there are no limits to the number of visas that can be given to Dominicans because they're not subject to national origins quotas. But there's a limit to the number that can be processed by the one guy sitting in the office in Santo Domingo. So there's long lines every day in the hot sun. At the same time, there's a growing social movement in the Dominican Republic opposed to U.S. imperialism on the island. Student movement, neighborhood groups start having regular demonstrations pushing for the United States to stop impeding the process of democracy. And those marches happen on the same street that the lines outside the visa offices, and in a couple instances, the two crowds merge and you get this kind of massive demonstration, which is very ironic. It's a demonstration that's basically, the message is Yankee go home and also give me a visa to come to the United States, right? Yankee go home and take me with you. And I think it's easy to chuckle about it, but it's actually really about a deeper question about the mythologies of 1965, right? Because if we as historians focus the public on decisions that Congress makes about opening and closing a spigot, we don't ask the question, is it actually true that everybody always wants to come to the United States? Is the United States really a beacon to the whole world in this kind of way that is imagined by US policy? Or is it the case that very specific kinds of people find themselves with the United States being the only outlet for them, or come to imagine the United States as an outlet for them in very specific contexts? And if you go back and look at the people who migrated to the United States after 1965, if you look at the top 10 groups, it's groups that you can find a pattern. The pattern is the people who decide that the United States is a place that they want to come to or have the resources or the relationship with the United States are places that were invaded or occupied by the United States. That's, or places where the United States, quote unquote, lost to a communist takeover. So China is a place that sends a lot of people because of the loss of China with the victory of the Communist Party. Cuba was a place that was multiply occupied but then lost. Vietnam was lost. Korea was occupied. The Philippines was multiply occupied, then lost, then regained and occupied. So it's a very consistent pattern, and I think it's really important not just to think about the foreign policy impetuses for U.S. policy, but also the way that the United States interacts with the world being part of the answer to the question of how people come to want to or try to facilitate movement to the United States, because it's not a historical truth that people want to move to the United States.
In the Soviet Jewish case, they had an option to go to Israel. They had an option to come to the United States at some times. And in the 1970s, when the United States actually was willing to accept more Soviet Jews at the time than before, the majority of people who had emigrated chose to come here, and the Israeli government went ballistic. 1980s, when the wave of emigration is larger, the interests of the Soviet Jews, the American Jewish activists were basically set to the side, And the American government, the Soviet government, and the Israeli government agreed that it would be better to steer the immigration flow to Israel. So in the Soviet case, we do have an instance in which we have an experiment. When the gates were open, most of the people were choosing to come here. With regard to the Haitians, it was the differential treatment that was a real bone of contention. It was part of the rise in black Jewish tensions in the 1980s. You know, this differential treatment between Haitian, blacks, and Soviet, Jewish, white, and why are the preferences being given? That's what.
That's actually a good lead-in to one of the questions that I was just passed about the relationship between this 1965 Act and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And, you know, I'm curious, I think we touched on this a little bit and somewhat obliquely, you know, that this kind of, what the liberal discourse was, what the laws actually managed to achieve. But I'm curious if in any of your work, that's something that, you know, you've reflected on, what that relationship, how we should understand the relationship.
I can speak to that in the Soviet Jewish case. In the early 1960s, the State Department was very reluctant to take up this issue. It was a matter of Soviet internal affairs. And if we're speaking about discrimination against Jews in the Soviet Union, well, just, you know, look at Birmingham, look at Selma. And that was an issue that the United States did not want to get into a fight with the Soviet Union over the treatment of domestic minorities. Because this was Cold War competition, there was competition for the alliance of states in Africa. And so there's a good book called Cold War Civil Rights that actually looks at the ways in which foreign policy considerations shaped. But there were a lot of reasons that the State Department was not eager to take up the Soviet Jewish issue. The treatment of African Americans in the US was one of them.
I mean, I'll just say very briefly, so this isn't part of my research, but they are passed at the same time. They are part of this liberal project, which is broadly affiliated with the Johnson administration. And there are people in this room, I hope I get this right. If I'm wrong, someone else can correct me. But I mean, essentially, Johnson puts a lot more effort or sort of thought behind the Civil Rights Act. Like, he's like a clear sense that this is a turning point in US history. My understanding is the 1965 Immigration Act, it's important, and he understands it's important because of this long history of sort of trying to get rid of the national origins quotas, but I don't think it has the same stickiness sort of in popular culture in 1964-65 that this is going to necessarily be a turning point or not. So people can disagree with that, but I think that when it's signed, I see them as both part of liberalism, and Johnson is more focused on African-American civil rights, and that's also more controversial, you know, in 1964 and 65. The 1965 Immigration Act, comparatively, is less so. That would be my take, but if there are others in the room who have better research, I'll take those points.
I really appreciate this question because one of the things that's been on my mind the whole day is the way that in our discussion of 1924, we haven't talked about blackness. And it's a really important thing to bring up. And this is not a critique of ourselves, because I think the things we've been talking about are really, really crucial and have been laid out. You know, how it relates to Asian American history, how it relates to particularly Mexican immigration and Jewish and non-Jewish European immigration. But I just want to tell a story about how 24 worked for black immigrants. So you know from Professor Nye, if you remember, that actually the Reconstruction era had made more room for black immigrants in some ways than some other racialized, non-white racialized groups, because they were allowed to naturalize. But the presumption was none of them would come, it wouldn't be an issue. And some do come, but the people who most come and take advantage of the relatively open borders and the ability to naturalize to some degree, although almost nobody's naturalizing before 1924, as you heard, are British West Indians, right? So you think about this as a post-emancipation migration. These are a group of people who have been emancipated from slavery, who are seeking ways, just like Southerners do in the 1950s and 60s, and 70s, and earlier, out of the plantation agriculture that the people who used to own them are now trying to push them into. And one of the strategies they take up is migration off of the islands. They migrate to work on the Panama Canal, they migrate to work in banana plantations and sugarcane in other parts of the Caribbean, and many of them end up in New York at some point, sometimes secondarily from that. And the pattern of migration is a pattern in which oftentimes women are migrating on their own, leaving their children behind in the islands, and oftentimes are migrating. They do depend on relatives to get them through. So they're either depending on other female relatives, adult relatives, or on adult male relatives, but it's more likely to be an uncle or a brother than a husband. Because in fact, in the British West Indies, there isn't church sanctified or state sanctified marriage in many of these post-emancipation communities, right? So family is really important, really valued, and totally moral, but doesn't look like the way family is supposed to look in certain kinds of visions of the world. And so when 1924 comes along, people from the British West Indies are targeted in a very, very specific way that doesn't say the word black, but we know that it was about this. And they're targeted because the Western Hemisphere is excluded from the quotas, but only the republics of the Western Hemisphere. And noting that the Dominion, that the Canada and Newfoundland are a Dominion, the Republicans and Canada and Newfoundland are excluded from it, which means that all of the places that are still British colonies in the period, and French colonies and Dutch colonies, which are mostly black population islands, are going to be cut off. And it's most important, obviously, for the British colonies because there's this massive flow. And the Jewish and Italian activists who fight so hard to preserve family reunification do that, and it means that after 24, many, many Jewish and Italian and Greek families can be reunified. But because of the way family structures don't match up to the family definitions within U.S. immigration law, those women whose children were left behind, might have been born as U.S. citizens had they been brought originally, but were left behind, have a real difficulty in reunifying their families, and it's really a brutal cutoff, and that is now attenuated in the 1960s by independence in the Caribbean, which then it applies a different set of rules, but then by the 1965 reform, so that those countries do get 20,000 or so spots. But they quickly, because of demand in these places which have such a long history of relationship with the United States, are so close and are so imbricated into labor recruitment regimes in the United States, they quickly have demand that far surpasses that number of slots. And so you have basically the same system of limited visas being the thing that restricts, and very clearly is used to restrict immigration from those places.
So another question we had is related to terminology and understanding. I think, Jana, you had made the point that category of refugee is a product of the Cold War, and the question is really, the person who asked it has familiarity with the use of that category earlier than the Cold War, so wanted to kind of understand a little bit more of what you meant.
So the word refugee does not start with the Cold War. So that's definitely true. It goes back to the Huguenots. It is a longer etymology, and it's used colloquially throughout the 19th and 20th century and even earlier. The point that I was making was about the legal category of refugee, not the language of refugee. And so what happens after the end of World War II, we get the 1951 UNHCR convention, which gives a
the UN
actually High Commissioner for Refugees. So the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, there's a conference in Geneva, and there's this international definition for refugee. It's actually extremely limited. They will protect Europeans who are displaced during World War II. Also, Palestinians are a completely other UN entity. And so you get this very, very narrow definition of refugee. It also does not include anyone who's displaced in Asia. And this is after the Chinese Revolution. So this is a legal definition, not the broader category. And one question would be, well, why do I care about this legal definition? Many scholars would say this legal definition is far too narrow. We should actually be much more capacious. We shouldn't have the UNHCR or the US government limit who we think should be a refugee and should not be. And I have a lot of political sympathies with that. I think the problem actually with the law is it asks for us to make delineations between someone who's facing persecution and someone who's fleeing for multiple reasons. Might be political persecution plus economics, climate change, there's all sorts of reasons. And so I'm not trying to argue that there is this fixed definition of refuginess, nor that there should be. I do think it's very important that we pay attention when governments create categories. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. And so the government, the US government, does not create a legal category of refugee until 1980. They have this category of parolee beforehand. And then you get the Mariel boat lift 3 months after the Refugee Act is passed, and the US government creates a new category, Cuban Haitian entrant. That's a different category that has fewer rights. Today, the United States admits very few people as refugees. They have all sorts of other categories. Temporary protective status. For people who are Afghanis, special immigration visas. Other people come in parolees. These are all ways, in general, to limit. And it's not that I'm arguing to create these categories, but we should pay attention to them, and we should think about why the government is creating them.
Right, and I think it bears remembering that for all of the creation of these categories, which as you were just enumerating them could make one's head spin, somebody who is ostensibly trying to flee a very difficult situation is then being asked to litigate the case that would allow them to be put into one of those such categories, right? And this relates to another question we received, which is so much of this project of state-based immigration and the patrolling of boundaries and borders is about sorting human beings and constructing and improvising these categories through which they could be sorted. And let's imagine that the political leaders who have tried to put into place policies had very good faith intentions, let's imagine, and that often when you create a category, it cannot fit every situation because you can't imagine every situation, and that there are these unintended, sometimes there are intended consequences, but there's certainly unintended consequences. So I'm not sure how you'll each approach this question, but I think we know that it feels like we're sort of on the brink of some kind of immigration reform, or at least that's a political talking point. So what do you learn from your research about what it would mean to approach this entire complex that has, more than a century's worth of precedent and law behind it? What would it mean to approach that in such a way that doesn't just continue to back us into the corner of, at the very least, unintended consequences that hurt a lot of human beings?
I'll bite. Whatever law is written, in the implementation always gets mediated. And I'm thinking specifically of the Soviet Jewish case, and when Jews emigrated from the Soviet Union, they could not come directly to the US. And they went to these transit points in Vienna and outside of Rome. And while they were there, they were met by representatives of HIAS, they were met by representatives of other organizations that then coached them on how to frame their narratives in line with what the US government was looking for to enable them to enter as parolees. Sasha Zborowski, who's at University of Pennsylvania, is doing research on this now, is a graduate student, and if there is immigration reform, I would expect that groups that have civil society organizations that are able to rally to their support will find advantage in whatever system comes up.
So, to a large degree, I despair of the idea of immigration reform in the current moment. I have seen the last ostensibly compromise, and I don't know whether it was jujitsu and therefore very effective, or whether it was just that the center of the Democratic Party no longer wants to defend immigrant rights and basically willing to give up on asylum altogether, which is a very troubling state of affairs. That said, I think that there's the problem is so big that there's room for an infinitude of kinds of ways of intervening, right? I think that it's really important for even as limited as the asylum system is, it's still important for people to be making arguments that people who are experiencing particular kinds of harm are owed asylum, right? Even though we would like to move beyond asylum as the only avenue. But I think if, and it's also, I think, really useful for some people to be out there saying we should eliminate borders altogether. I don't know that that's strategic in this moment, but I think it's important to expand the window of conceptual window of what can be discussed. In terms of my own, like if there were just two little things that you could inject into the conversation that might move the needle a little bit, one is deterrence. I think deterrence, the assumption that deterrence functions in immigration policy is wrong. It's clearly demonstrated to be wrong, and all it does is increase human misery and suffering. And I think that as a democratic nation, you can disagree about whether or not who you want to come in and how many and under what terms, but I think we shouldn't disagree about whether or not we should use inhumane deterrence to try and punish people for not following those rules. And the other thing is due process, right? I think that it would be shocking to most Americans to understand that due process doesn't exist really at all in the immigration system in a way that's completely out of step with even the, we know, imperfect norms of US criminal and civil law.
I also wish I could be more optimistic. I appreciate both of those points. I mean, this is such a cop-out in some ways, but there both needs to be political movement on the ground and more imagination, maybe more imagination than I have, to think about what could, in fact, improve the situation. I do think that there, given our situation, needs to be changes in the laws, but I get fearful that the laws will be more coercive and more brutal as opposed to more expansive. And so my hope for legal solutions, I think, may be not very well founded. And I do think that things often go outside of the law and states' imaginations as well. So things will also change on the ground. How they change, we do not know, but I do think that there needs to be sort of ongoing support for both more humane processes and to have a much broader sense of what can be possible. So, anyway, I'll stop there.
Well, I want to thank this panel for sharing your expertise, for sharing the very kind of specific elements of your research that inform this question. And clearly we're talking about history and we're talking about social processes and law. And I think we can just be frank that we're also very much thinking about the world today. So I really appreciate that you brought that kind of consciousness of like what it means to be a human being today in this system to your comments. So thank you very much.